Hello, I'm your virtual content specialist for second grade social studies, and today we're going to be looking at Unit 3, Day 10. The learning target. Learn that the English forcibly took over New York City and consider this historical event from multiple perspectives. I'm going to look at some strategies today to elicit writing responses. Best practices for eliciting strong student writing responses for second graders. Review the questions with the students prior to reading the text. Model for students how to act like historians and find evidence in the text through research. Scaffolding writing by using sentence starters. I'm going to go over all three of these. So the New York State Social Studies Framework and Field Guide highlight 3 instructional shifts. The purpose of the shifts is to guide teachers in delivering deeper and more meaningful social studies instruction. I'm going to look here at shift number 3. Integrate content and skills purposefully. Effective social studies teaching and learning. So what they're talking about is the shift is from a social studies classroom where students experience an additional nonfiction reading class or textbook focused instruction. And it's going to shift to a social studies classroom where students learn to read, discuss, and write like social scientists. So in order to do that, the teaching and the learning has to be about both content and skills. And it takes intentional instruction design to integrate the two in a way that benefits student learning. As students develop disciplinary ways of thinking, for example, practices, they learn to think like geographers, historians, economists, and citizens. They also develop the various literacy skills outlined by the next generation literacy standards as they read, communicate, and write within the disciplines. So that's really important here that not only are you building upon best literacy practices, which is from a traditional looking at nonfiction and informational text, but that you're also pairing it with the skill of thinking and acting like social scientists. So having that lens when you're doing social studies. So here are some key ideas from the social studies framework. So in this unit, thinking about, and specifically in this lesson, time, continuity, and change. Identifying continuities and changes over time can help understand historical developments. Continuities and changes over time in communities can be described using historical thinking, vocabulary, and tools such as timelines. Continuities and changes over time in communities can be examined by interpreting evidence such as maps, population charts, photographs, newspapers, biographies, artifacts, and other historical materials. So in this lesson, you're going to be using a read aloud that discusses a historical event to help the kids and understand what's happening in time and how the changes are taking place. Okay, so here's the slide from the model portion of the lesson. You're going to be listening to the read aloud on the day Peter Stuyvesant sailed into town. And it wants you to ask a question afterwards or answer the question below. How do you think the settlers felt about Peter Stuyvesant coming? So what we want you to do is preview this question before you start the read aloud. Instead of asking the question after and saying, okay, now let's ask this question. Have your students read the question first. That way, when they're listening to the read aloud, then they can become the social scientists or historical detectives that they are, so that they'll be listening for this part and listening for the facts as the story is read to them. Okay? So here are some of the strategies. So you're going to preview the question first with the students prior to reading the text. Then you might want to use an anchor chart like stop, think, and jot, or some kind of reading strategy that you might have from some of your literacy lessons, where the students are thinking about what they need to be looking for, stopping and asking questions, and maybe jotting down some notes. And then you will do a think aloud strategy to model the connections while you're reading the story. This will help the students have a model for how they would do it themselves while they're listening to the story. And here's an example of a stop, think, and jot nonfiction anchor chart. So it's just some questions or some ideas to think about while you're reading the story. So once again, here's our question. How do you think the settlers felt about Peter Stuyvesant coming? So after you finish the read aloud, then you will ask the question again. And this time, you might want to help the students brainstorm how you will find this information before even writing down the answer. So let's think in time. When, right, Peter Stuyvesant is coming to town, when is he coming to town? When in the story does that happen? So just like they've been learning about a timeline, they can think of the book as a timeline. What part of the story is when he comes to town? So they can help brainstorm. Well, that was at the beginning. Well, great. So you're going to go back to the beginning of the book. So with this part of the book, how do you think the settlers felt? Because we know from the story that the settlers do change back and forth between their opinions about Peter Stuyvesant. So it's important that the students understand that you're asking how he felt when Peter Stuyvesant was coming. So you're going to ask at that point, how do you think the settlers felt? So you might get happy or excited as an answer. But what evidence in the text makes you think that? What part did you hear? What kind of words did they say? Was there a sentence that showed that? And so from the story, the text said, all the people came running to greet him. They shot off a cannon and waited in line so every last Dutchman could meet him. So those would be some examples to back up why the students thought they were happy or excited. Also, at the end of that, there's a picture showing the whole town waiting in line, coming to meet him. So one of the illustrations shows everyone waiting in line to meet Peter Stuyvesant. Okay. So now that you've brainstormed your thinking, you've talked a lot about how a historian or a social scientist needs to go back as a detective and find evidence in the text, your students are ready to answer the question in writing. So one way to scaffold writing, especially if your students are still struggling to get their sentences going, is always to talk about the skill of restating the question into a sentence and doing that by helping them with sentence starters. So you could have something like, I think the settlers felt blank about Peter Stuyvesant coming. I know this because in the story, what would they say? I read that they got in line, the whole town got in line, or they shot off a cannon. Or from the picture, I saw the whole town waiting in line. People were smiling. And these are examples of sentence starters, but of course you can design your own sentence starters. And this will help your students get their writing going. So to review, the best practices for eliciting strong student writing responses: preview the questions with the students prior to reading the text. Model for students how to act like historians and find evidence in the text through research. Scaffolding your writing by using sentence starters. All right. Hope you have a lot of success getting your students to answer questions like the social scientists that they're learning to be.